Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arfat, and today I have another unboxing to do. Another package just came in the mail. This time around, it is from Amazon. So let's unbox this package and see what book we have inside. Okay, here is the Bible in translation, ancient and English version by the late distinguished professor from Princeton University, Professor Bruce Metzger, who is also a textual critic, and he is responsible for the RSV and the NRSV, the Revised Standard Version of the New Testament of the Bible, as well as the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Now, I've always been fascinated by his work. I've read tons of his work, and he's written tons. So this is something that I've not read, and this is something that I'm exploring in my research area about the ancient versions of the Bible. Professor Metzger obviously have another volume, which is published by Oxford University Press, earlier version of the New Testament. The book is out of print now, but you can find it. I'm sure you can find it online. You can find it at your local library if you live in the States and the UK, most probably. So this book actually speaks about the ancient version of the Bible, as well as the history of it throughout the ages, the centuries, leading all the way to about today. And there's a lot of works written about this, like canon-wise and things like that. But this is focusing basically on translations of the Bible, because he is heavily involved with two of the major translations of the New Testament of the Bible, and so he has his experience, and he has had written this book. Obviously, he passed away in the mid 2000s, something like that. So this will be just a quick video of me unboxing, but nevertheless, let's explore into this canon of the New Testament, or translation of the New Testament. We'll focus our attention on the New Testament here specifically. The New Testament, I've also planned a video whereby I show you ancient writing materials and comparing it to modern writing materials, and with the reed pens that they are using, as well as the early manuscripts were written in papyrus. And in my future video, I'll actually show you like a physical papyrus, because I'm interested in all these antiquities stuff. So maybe that will be a future video, inshallah ta'ala. But today, about the canon, the writing material, the earliest New Testament, quote unquote New Testament. It wasn't called the New Testament until much later on. But the earliest manuscripts that we have that are extant basically is an academic word meaning that in our possession. So when I say manuscripts that are extant, it's manuscripts that we have. Obviously, there's a lot of works that are no longer extant, meaning works that have been cited by church fathers, or versions that have been cited by church fathers that are no longer in our possession, meaning either archaeological discoveries have not been made to them, whether they are they're fragments, and we do not have some of these quotations. It could be that they're just lost through time because they do not survive. Papyrus have been tested to survive, have withstood the test of time, because in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, it is actually a trash bin, like a rubbish dump, and a lot of papyrus have been discovered there. It is also sometimes called the Oxford Papyrus because they're discovered by a team of Oxford excavators working alongside some other um, um, parties involved. And so the ancient manuscripts were written in papyrus, and they were written using a reed pen. You can Google reed pen, REED. Sometimes it is made of bamboo, sometimes it is made of like reed plants. And the ink that they use is like a dye, and so it is interesting to research into all these things. Like you actually know what materials scribes actually use. And if you've ever used fountain pens, like not like really deep fountain pens, you'll know that it is actually frustrating to use. And so we're actually blessed with modern technology and things like that. But nevertheless, it is actually interesting if you actually explore into the art of writing using ancient materials under the ancient Roman lamp, if you get what I mean, the oil lamp, which often spills, and all these things you can purchase on Amazon. They're available to be bought from Amazon and from some other website, eBay, for example. And so the ancient manuscripts, they differ in writing materials, but a portion of them were actually written. The earlier ones were written in papyrus, made out of papyrus plant, and then much later in medieval world, some of them were written in vellum, because vellum was actually very expensive. It is one of the most expensive ancient writing materials. The Quran were written mostly in vellum. They're not written in papyrus because the Western Arabs do not have access to papyrus. That is why the earlier Quran were actually written in leaves, but most prominently they were written in animal skin. So there's a difference here. The same goes for the Hebrew scripture, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were written from parchment, meaning the back of animal skin that have been, like, we have the skin scrape off. I mean the fur scrape off, and then the vellum gets stretched and it gets beaten up. It gets processed, and then it gets dried up, and so that it becomes parchment. Today, you can buy parchment, but for an A2 size, it will cost you about $100 US. And also you need special brushes and special ink to write on vellum. And nevertheless, if you do want to take up that art, it is an expensive art. Nevertheless, for me, I'll just take up the papyrus art, because I'm more interested in learning about the ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, because I do not have access to vellum, and it is also very costly to have access to one, to buy one. Now, when we come to about translation, obviously there's another book. If you want to read, it is by Jaroslav Pelikan, whose Bible is it. That work is not focused mainly on translation, but it does contain chapters about translation of the New Testament, the Bible, over the years. So when we talk about translation, how did the translation over the years occurs? The earliest, obviously, the manuscripts were written in Greek, and then they were translated into Latin, for example, by scribes. They were translated into Syriac, which is the Aramaic, modern Aramaic, actually modern in a sense that it is back then. Um, Another word for Aramaic is Arami, and they were also translated into Arabic. Sidney Griffith has written a book, a Bible in Arabic, something that is you should actually explore into his work. So they were translated into many, and later on they were translated into Germanic languages, Slovaks, for example, because the Germanic tribe became Christians, although Arian Christians, and so they invented their own Gothic script, their own Gothic language, and their Gothic writing script, and so from the 5th and 6th century onwards, they have the Gothic Bible, the Gothic New Testament, Gothic Bible. It was translated into English sometime around the 16th, 15th century, even though much earlier, but the prominent ones, especially on the 15th, 16th century by Tyndale. Obviously, he has his predecessors, but the translation of Tyndale is much important. William Tyndale, by the way, because there's a lot of controversies surrounding the manuscripts that he produced. Obviously, you can read what happened to him, and unfortunate things that happen, not only just to him but to the people, the translators of the time, because not only that their books were burned, their translations were burned, but they themselves were burned at the stake. If we look at the case of Joseph Priestley, for example, he had to flee. Because of his beliefs, not because of his translation, but because of his beliefs. But it is nevertheless tied down to because if you look at some of these Unitarian Protestant during the time of the Reformation. Now I'm using the word Protestant here very loosely, even though it is anachronistic, but very loosely I'll be using this term today. There are a group of Unitarians that actually reject the Trinitarian beliefs and dogmas and translations of the New Testament of the Bible in a whole. And they were persecuted, they were heavily marginalized, they almost went into extinction. But luckily they survived till today, and so we have a different form of Christianity. Christianity has always been diverse, so that's the translation, I would also say. The translation, there are many translators over the years that have translated, and some of them have deviated widely from the translation, from the Greek, as David Bedion here. I've reviewed the book, The Truth in Translation. This is a very important work, by the way. Truth in Translation. You should have this handy, especially if you want to get into debates, if you want to get into the academic route, not just being polemical, but actually have evidence to provide to the audience. And so translations over the years also plays a major part in one's theological beliefs, because if you look at the translations of today, the KJV and the NKJV, the NRSV follow pretty much the New King James Version, or King James Version, even though it has been revised and things like that. I would actually prefer the RSV, the first edition of the RSV, because the first edition of the RSV actually contains it doesn't have a lot of theological inputs. Obviously, the second edition of the RSV, we started getting back all these Trinitarian passages that is in 1 John, for example. which is not there in the ancient manuscripts. And obviously the NRSV still has it, even though they have it in parentheses, in brackets. But in my opinion, if it's not there to begin with, and it is, if strongly it is a later interpolation, then it should be removed completely. Because Christians today read the Bible as the Word of God. And it is actually unthinkable to have all these passages that are a later interpolation. They are much later interpolation. And this is not just based on any wild theses, because they're not there in the ancient manuscripts, the best attested to ancient manuscripts. Now obviously scholarships have moved along. If you follow textual criticism, it no longer goes by the Alexandrian script, okay, the Antiochian script, for example, the Western script, the Syriac script. They no longer follow that, because that is actually has been proven to not be quite accurate. And so now scholarships are still changing if you follow the works written by scholars, for example. And so we no longer look at it from that angle. But nevertheless, if we were to look at it from that angle, the Alexandrian manuscripts and probably some scholars believe the Antiochian manuscripts, they're was one of the best attested to, but I would disagree with this way of looking at things, as has been proven to be mistaken by works over the years. And so it is actually much better, according to some scholars, to look at things like to go back to the earliest manuscripts that we have, like Codex Bezae, for example, in the 5th century, Sinaiticus Vaticanus in the 4th century, and they contained books that are not even found in the New Testament today. And so why are they not in the New Testament today? Because over the years, scholars believe that not scholars believe, like scribes believe that they were not apostolic, and so this is also the reason why that scribes do not translate them, and some of these manuscripts were only recently discovered, okay, and because they have not been translated, they have not been preserved. Now a lot of the Greek, ever since the Western Church took over after Chalcedon, Latin became the lingua franca. And also because Greek dies off, but it was the Christians in Central Asia, the Manichaean Christians, that actually translated some of these Greek and preserved some of these Greek works, though they translated them, and they do not mostly copy them in Greek. They translated them because a lot of people in Central Asia do not read Greek. And so nevertheless, Greek manuscripts continued to be copied, but in small at a small scale. And so the Bible in Greek wasn't copied anymore, and we have a lot of manuscripts of the Bible that are actually not in the Greek language, that are extant in our possession today. About 5,800 last count in 2020, comparing it to like 20,000 over in different languages, in fragmentaries as well as in complete copies. And so you can tell over the years that the original language of the New Testament wasn't preserved. And if it wasn't for like archaeological discoveries, a lot of these we will not have 5,000 over Greek manuscripts. Now these are not complete manuscripts by large. The earlier we get, the less complete they are. Like for example, we do not have within the first 3 centuries a complete Pauline epistle. We do not have the complete New Testament. All this came about only in the mid 4th century, currently extant. Now, if there were to be a discovery, um, definitely it'll be an interesting one if we have like the Pauline epistles, complete Pauline epistles. Although, if you follow closely what scholars have been saying, the modern versions of the New Testament completely differs to that of the Antiquities and to that of the much earlier we go. And so they're not the same, and I don't think they will be the same, and they're never going to be the same. Because if you follow along Metzger's another work, textual commentary of the Greek New Testament, you realize that his committee, and the committee of translators actually chose what the Word of God should be for the Christians out there. And it is unfortunate that a lot of Christians are not aware of this. They are it is a very unfortunate situation, because they thought all along that this is actually the ancient, whatever they have today is what the ancients read. And that is actually, unfortunately, not true at all. But a lot of Christians have this perception. They thought that whatever they read today in their Bible, even though it is translated into English, and the ancient, they do not even know, some of them, what are the original language of the New Testament, of the Bible. And so the Bible, the New Testament, were written in Greek, and the older parts of the Old Testament slash Tanakh slash Hebrew Bible, they're written in Hebrew, and the much earlier, towards the time of Jesus, they're written in Aramaic. And so the Bible actually written in three languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, which is also Syriac, and Greek. Yeah. Latin was the next translation, but simultaneously they were translated. The Bible was translated into Syriac, into Coptic, which is a much later Egyptian writing after the hieroglyphs, influenced by, if I'm not mistaken, probably I'm mistaken, influenced by Greek script, if I'm not mistaken. A mixture of Greek script, Hebrew script, things like that. Yeah, so the Bible, it is unfortunate that a lot of Christians today thought that English, some of them, unfortunately, and I've seen this online, that they thought that English is actually the original language of the New Testament, of the Bible, and that is unfortunately not true at all. English was an influence of the French and Germanic language much later, the Anglo-Saxons language, and Latin was a very huge language as well. Ever since the 6th century onwards, liturgies were conducted in Latin, no longer in Greek. As well, liturgies in what we have today, the northern Arabia, they were pretty much in Syriac, in Arabic, because we do have Christians, Nestorian Christians, in Abyssinia, in what we have today, below Egypt. What is that country? Abyssinia, Ethiopia. Yeah. And so Greek, the original Greek language in translation as well as in liturgies, died off completely. And so the Greek of today and the Greek of the New Testament is also different. The New Testament is in Koine Greek, meaning marketplace Greek, like common Greek, and the pronunciation of Koine Greek, and obviously, first of all, the Koine Greek pronunciation that we have today is just mere guesses, mere guesses, and it is made up from like modern Greek pronunciation. No one knows how Koine Greek actually sounded like, because no one alive today actually have access to recordings of how Koine Greek was actually spoken. Obviously, if you study languages, you know that pronunciations and diphthongs and all these things changes over the years, and even the Hebrew language as well, the Aramaic as well, English as well. And so no one really knows how Koine Greek actually sounded like. The same way no one actually knows how ancient Egyptian sounded like. Today we have all these hieroglyphic writings and things like that, and an attempt at reconstruction how they might actually sounded like, but no one knows how ancient languages sounded like. Yeah, and so Koine Greek is actually different as well from modern Greek, and if you use some Koine Greek phrases and pronunciation, the modern Greek will still understand you, but you'll find it funny nevertheless. Yeah, so it is unfortunate that actually the translators were because the translators have access to the Greek manuscripts that they have chosen. These are first they need to have these Greek manuscripts. Meaning they'll sift through all ancient Greek manuscripts. They focus on ancient Greek manuscripts. They discarded. They do not focus on Latin, Aramaic, Syriac, Coptic, and things like that. They focus on the Greek manuscripts that they have extant. And no two of them are the same. So they sift through all this rubble. They pick and choose which one is actually ancient according to their understanding. And some of them disagree, and it is written here. It is all documented. Some of them disagree with one another as to what it should be, and some of them actually the disagreement actually is vehemently it's to that extent whereby they just couldn't decide between the two, because the evidence goes both ways, and so they refer back to like ancient translations and things like that to try to figure out how it should be. What are the more plausible way? For example, ancient scribes, do they have the tendency to expand a text, or do they have a tendency to reduce the amount of letters in a text? And so this led to the Griesbach hypothesis, as well as the Markan priority. Was Matthew the first source, and then the author of Mark redacted Matthew by eliminating a lot of Matthew, or was Mark first, and then Matthew and Luke expanded Mark? And so these two hypotheses have a huge following, but scholars agree, and I also agree along with them, that actually Mark is first, because Ehrman did a fantastic research, Professor Ehrman, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, that scribes actually have the tendency to expand the text, to include all these theological motifs into the text, or sometimes to make text seems clearer, or to emphasize. For example, one great example is the opening phrase of Gospel according to Mark. This is the Evangelion of Jesus, of Christ, the Son of God. The phrase "Son of God" here is actually not found in our ancient manuscripts, the best attested to ancient manuscripts, but it could be that scribes wanted to emphasize, because chapter 15 actually contained that Jesus is the Son of God, and so scribes actually wanted to emphasize much earlier on. And so they could have copied this chapter 15 verse Son of God and input it earlier into the verse to emphasize to the readers, or to make it clear to the readers, that this is actually the gospel, okay, or the good news of Christ, the Son of God. Whereas the Son of God phrase is actually not there in the ancient manuscripts at all. And so there's a lot of tendency for scribes to expand a text in order to emphasize to their audience. The same way that unfortunately, it is unfortunate, I should say, that some of these texts have been mistakenly lengthened, because scribes would actually write notes, okay, and then the other ancient scribes actually thought that this is part of the manuscripts, and so they actually copied that into the manuscripts. And so we have unfortunate mistakes like this as well, which is why medieval Quranic scholars, they actually prevented their students from actually writing on the same page of the vellum, because later scribes, centuries after them, or a few decades after them, might mistaken that this is actually part of the Quran, whereas it is just a commentary. Okay, it is just like scribal notes. Okay, in what we have today, footnotes. Okay, footnotes are at the foot of the page for a reason. Yeah, and so, but the ancient way of writing footnotes is not at the bottom. They'll just write it in like on top of the text, or just next to it if there's space, mostly because parchments are very expensive, and so they're mostly written to the full extent of the page. And so sometimes scribes will actually scribble a note, okay, and unfortunately later copyists will actually thought that this is actually part of the New Testament, and that scribes had forgotten, because the homoiouton happens, and so they thought that this is actually should be in the passage, and so this is a mistake, a scribal error, human error nevertheless. Some of them actually changes the text deliberately, and unfortunately as well, some translators of the modern Bible, and this is documented in academic works, for example by Bidun here that I've shown you. Okay, some translators deliberately rendered the Greek into English that is just completely theologically biased. I would not use the word dishonest, but theologically biased. The word proskuneo in Greek, it doesn't mean worship, it means paying homage. In the Gospel of Matthew, when the wise men from the east, they came because they wanted to pay Jesus homage. The same word proskuneo was used much later on, and then the translators have it worship him. For example, when Jesus ascended in Luke, the very last chapter in Luke, when Jesus ascended up into heavens, the disciples worship him. That is completely wrong use of the word. The word there should be and pay him homage, the same way we found the same word occurs in Matthew and in some other places as well. And because the modern readers do not read it in Greek, they thought that this is actually a different word, whereas it is not a different word. It's just been translated differently. Now, I do understand that certain words can be translated into many different words, but it doesn't make sense. If you look at the context of it, it doesn't make sense. And so the much better renderings of the word proskuneo should be paying homage. Because if you look at it, the Bible is actually biased, and this is something that I actually look it up. Something that is just at the back of my mind. Once you've read the New Testament many times, you start to realize that whenever it comes to the disciples of Jesus, okay, for example, when it comes to the disciple of Jesus, it is always theologically motivated, that they have this, like the translators actually make them revere Jesus as like God. And whenever it is somebody apart from the disciples of Jesus, it is always as if Jesus is like a mere man. And I don't know if this is something that is actually manufactured into the translation, or is this just something that is, by chance. Obviously I do not believe anything happens by chance, because everything is in the qadar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But let's suppose we remove any theology out of this thing here. And so if you understand this, if you read the gospel many times, you start to realize this, especially in John, when it comes to the Samaritan woman. All theology about Jesus being God in the NRSV and the RSV is not there. But when it comes to the disciples of Jesus, suddenly Jesus' status become like part of the Trinity, for example. And yeah, there's a lot of problems when it comes to translation. The same problems that we have, especially if you read a number of different translations of the Quran into English. Some of these translators actually they did not stay true to the Arabic. They do not stay true to the actual Arabic. Like in some translations, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Okay, the translators, they actually, some of the one translate, obviously I will not mention who, but they have it like God is not a father and God is not a son, whereas that is not found at all in the Arabic. And why are you restricting the meaning of the Quran into just father and son? Like, why are you just restricting the meaning of the Quran to cater only to Christians? Now, if that is your intended audience, I mean, there's no problem with that, but you shouldn't, mistranslate on purpose. And so I'm not only having issues with these when it comes to the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible as well. For example, if we go to Genesis, for example, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, the very first chapter of Genesis. That is actually not how it should be translated, and this is what we found in the KJV and KJV. At least the NIV, if I'm not mistaken, the NIV have it when God began to create. That is a much better rendering of the Hebrew. Okay, it is not it should not be in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Oh yeah, sorry. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and this is found in NIV as well. That is actually a bogus translation. It is not in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. It is when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Yeah. So there's a lot of problems. I have a lot of problems with translation. And this goes across all board. Unitarian translations as well. And all translations are theologically motivated. All translations, they are theologically biased. And that is why you need to go back to the original. and it doesn't take a lot of time for you to be able to try and read Greek. It takes a lot of effort to try and read the Quran in Arabic, to at least understand a few words that you read, because after you understand a few words, you understand a lot more. Now, I'm not here speaking about trying to have conversations in Arabic. um, I'm just saying here to try and at least when you read the Greek word, for example, and arche, you understand what it actually means. Now, obviously, if you are not a native speaker, unless you actually involve yourself heavily in learning languages, you'll never understand every single word in the New Testament, in the Quran, in the Hebrew Bible. But at least you understand bits and pieces here and there to actually help you as well. Yeah, and obviously learning languages is an entire lifetime exercise, and but the very basic thing is to actually recognize the Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic alphabet to be able to pronounce a word. Most of the time you'll be reading this to yourself, so you don't actually need to understand exactly how the words is pronounced. That comes much later on, but most of the time you just be reading this to yourself, and so it doesn't really actually matter how it is pronounced, as long as you understand the words, for example. So anyway, I've delved into many topics in this video, whereas the intention is just to review to unbox this book. Yeah, so hopefully this video benefits you. My name is Arfad, and I'll see you on my next one. Any mistakes that I've made is my own, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from all mistakes. I'll see you next time. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.